Hello, I'm a space wolf. Awoo! I wasn't going to bother covering the whole Games Workshop female custodes thing, but here we are. For those who don't know, Games Workshop, their dam, their barrier against ill thought out progressive changes to their game world has begun to crack. They have announced that they are bringing in female Adeptes Custodes. Or rather, they're saying that this was always the case. So they announced it in the most slapdash and lazy way ever, in a tweet that basically said, "We have always been at war with East Asia." A clumsy retcon with no real justification. As I say, I wasn't going to cover it, but I've had a couple of requests, and a tweet I made about all of this has been hugely popular, so I guess we'll see if it works on YouTube. All hail Algorithmo. Accept my sacrifice. So rightly or wrongly, this is being seen as the thin end of the wedge, and goddamn, there's a lot of dumb people on both sides of this argument. From one extreme, taking the DEI, fiscal pressure and censorship to the level of an insane conspiracy theory, to on the other side, people not reading a goddamn word I said in my tweet and defaulting to cruise control abuse. Yeah, there's been a bunch of valid arguments over the years against female Astartes and other transhuman monstrosities in the 40k universe, from 40 plus years of lore, 40 plus because some of it goes all the way back to Warhammer Fantasy Battle and even its predecessor Reaper back in the day, through to relatively scientific and biological plausibility and other factors. I mean, Custodes aren't exactly the same as Astartes, but there's a lot of crossover, just as with the Thunder Warriors, and they're similar enough that many of the arguments that have been made do hold. However, in my not-so-humble opinion, as a game designer and as a full-time professional creative person, for what that counts, and as someone who has played since, first edition 40k, but not for a while. So in my opinion, the lore and other questions and arguments about female Custodes or Astartes aren't really the crux of the matter. And I think instead people should look at the aesthetic, the theme, the mood. What is the game about? What is the Imperium of Man about? What are its themes? What are the questions it is trying to ask and to answer? The Imperium of Man is not meant to be an egalitarian or a fair society of equality, right? If you want that shit, go to the Tau. The Imperium of Man is feudal. It's dark. It's a dark age. The question that it asks in the 40k universe is, what is justified in the face of annihilation? How much oppression and nastiness can you justify by the fact that if you don't do that, your entire species is going to be wiped out? The Imperium of Man is a theocratic thanatocracy and a society that is engaged in total war. So does this modernist egalitarianism therefore have a place in this Imperium? And the answer is simply no. It breaks the aesthetic thrust and conceits of the setting and of the faction. It doesn't support or emphasize the unfairness, the cruelty, or the stark and overt religious overtones of the setting. A setting, by the way, that was originally very much inspired by Nemesis the Warlock in the UK science fiction anthology comic 2000 AD. Nemesis itself being a series in which the humans are the bad guys and are in a dark age and are basically a caricature of National Front type racists from the 70s and 80s here in the UK. There's a lot of parallels between these two things. So yeah, it's not meant to be nice. It's not meant to be egalitarian. It's not meant to be fair or inclusive as a fictional society in the game. It is a massive empire of religious bigots. So again, does this modernist egalitarianism have a place in the Imperium? No, it doesn't. These militaristic orders are meant to echo the Knights Martial from our own history, the Teutonic Knights, the Hospitallers, the Order of St. James, the Templars, and so on and so on and so on. Space Marines and other similar factions like the Custodes are monastic, ascetic. They are battle brothers. They are streamed by gender. Furthermore, there are factions, heroes, etc. that do break people's gender expectations. But as individuals like Joan of Arc, just as in the real world, things were that way, and so they are in this, which is meant to rhyme, to put it in George Lucas' terms, with that real world history and to evoke those things from our history. History is being echoed. The Imperium of Man is a new dark age for mankind, a reversal of progress in extremis. And we have the Sisters of Battle, which is an all-female faction, for one, and one that delightfully tweaks the nose of legalistic theological interpretation of religious scripture in the real world. It's a legal loophole, as much as declaring seabirds to be fish so that Catholics could eat them on a Friday. The Sisters of Battle adds to the setting, it doesn't take away. And a similar result here could have been achieved by giving a greater prominence and creating new models for the Sisters of Silence, rather than headbutting this particular hornet's nest in such a crude way. After all, for every monk there's a nun, right? For every monastic order there's a nun order. People shrieking sexist, etc. are also missing the mark, missing the point. I mean, it's easier to shriek and point than to try to understand. So much for empathy as a core value, I suppose. But at the end of the day, ultimately, this is just going to harm yet another company that produces entertainment, pandering to people who mostly aren't their customer base, while cannibalizing their own customer base and driving a lot of their core audience elsewhere. It's a very peculiar decision for any company to make, and yet we see it a lot lately, which is why the whole DEI conspiracy theories spin out of control, because it makes sense of something that doesn't make sense. The self-harm that these companies are engaged in. Sooner or later, you would think someone would figure that out, but things are so distorted that the loans from these companies seem to be more important than actually having a customer base who actually buy your shit. But even companies that have suffered from this under their own hubris, like Wizards of the Coast or Disney, don't seem to have figured this out yet or learned the lesson. As a quick addendum here, there are some very strange arguments going on. Some people seem to think that rejecting female figures from one singular part of a faction within the setting means you hate actual women and don't want them playing the game at all. This is similar to the arguments that have been had in the role-playing community, that just because you don't want certain magical artifacts or disabled characters or whatever in your game, that means you're necessarily excluding people who have real life disabilities from your table, but the two things are very different and never the twain shall meet, or at least that's how it should be. The one doesn't follow at all from the other. A game's lore and content isn't and shouldn't be much of anything to do with people's attitudes and interactions in real life. I dare say that for Warhammer, like every other hobby that gets this kind of accusation, they would love it if anybody and everybody played and enjoyed the game. They just don't want their thing changed. They don't want strangers and tourists moving in and gentrifying it and changing it in the process. And this inability that the critics seem to have to perceive the line between reality and fantasy always disturbs me, because these were the arguments that moral entrepreneurs, the purveyors of moral panic, such as Pat Pulling or Jack Thompson, this is their argument, that games or other media somehow have this magical power to brainwash people, and people can't tell the difference between reality and fantasy, but it always seems to be those critics that have those issues, not the people that are actually into the fiction and the hobbies. It's nonsense. But if you can't tell the difference between reality and fantasy and what you have in a faction and how you treat people in real life, then it's you that has the problem, and it's you that probably shouldn't engage with fiction of any kind at all, ever. But I can't help but wonder what brain damage leads to this conclusion from these people. It's very, very odd. Zang. Sup, bitches? I'm reliably informed that I'm terrible at pimping my stuff. So here I am, pimping my stuff in what's hopefully an amusing way. If you want to interact with me and follow me, you can find me on Twitter @Grimasaur and @Mort_post for official announcements.